Good afternoon. Ed Lee, City Administrator, and I've been working with our mayor. We just hosted a fairly large meeting, a long one, but one that was, I think the comments from the people who attended, some 75 people from many different neighborhoods, in particular Bayview, Hunters Point, Visitacion Valley, to talk with us and with the mayor to signify a whole, I think, agreed upon viewpoint that the violence that we've been seeing happen in some of the celebrated cases are certainly ones that we don't tolerate. And with that, I'll let the mayor speak about the meeting today and some of the other speakers.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks to everyone that participated in the meeting. We had, roughly an hour and a half, 2 hour plus conversation and dialogue with community leaders from throughout the city, representing, I think, the best of San Francisco. And it's a community that recognizes, at the end of the day, it's right to celebrate all our interesting differences, but a community that is always reminded of the things that bind us together, that common humanity that Dr. King talked so eloquently about. This is the city's birthplace is the United Nations. This is a city that recognizes its strength is in its diversity. This is a city that has not always followed through in terms of our broader rhetoric. This is a city that, as all of you know, is a city that has struggled, like other cities, to right the wrongs of racial injustice and bigotry, and recognizes that we can always do more and always do better. That being said, this is a city that's very proud to have over a third of its population of Asian descent, and I imagine that number will be adjusted even higher when the new census data comes out. This is a city that marks a proud past in terms of the contributions of the African American community, and this is a city whose leadership has transcended its 47.5 square miles, not throughout just the Bay Area, the state, this nation, for that matter, the world that we're trying to build. The issue of the tensions that have come to the surface because of some high-profile incidents in the Chinese community as it relates to crimes where victims were disproportionately Chinese has been not only disturbing, but has been alarming because it heightened what I believe has been lying beneath the surface in terms of concern and stress and fear that exists in our city for a number of communities, but not least of which some members of the Asian community. And those incidents have, I think, brought us closer together, not further apart, in terms of being willing to acknowledge not only their existence, but acknowledge that we have work to do as a city to reconcile them, that we have work to do to move this city closer together and fulfill the promise of this city. And so we had an honest and thoughtful dialogue where we unanimously, every single person in that room, condemned the violence in this city, specifically the violence that has occurred in 3 high-profile incidents in our city as it relates to victims were Chinese. We condemn violence generally. We acknowledge that violence by no means is exclusive to one race or one group or one ethnicity, that violence is perpetuated every day in this city in ways large and small. We recognize that the incidents that have occurred that have gotten attention are by no means the only incidents that may have occurred, that there are incidents that occur that are not reported or candidly are underreported, that there's fear for people to come forward. And that fear was also discussed in the course of our meeting. But that at the end of the day, we know we need to work together. And no one was pointing fingers. No one was criticizing of any other. We all recognize we need to step up and we need to do more and we need to do better. We have some very specific ideas that we will be advancing, some large, some small, some symbolic, some substantive, from advancing a reward for one of our earlier incidences, which we'll talk about in a moment. Chief will talk more specifically about that with the strong urging of President David Chu and others. We agreed that that would be appropriate. We also recognize that we have a lot of work to do in terms of our efforts to outreach to our diverse communities this message of unity in the context of being more proactive and being more present within the African American and Asian community. The idea of more PSAs, the idea of doing some youth-led videos, some ideas of reaching out particularly to our senior community, and some specific recommendations that we'll be advancing very soon. We will happily discuss that with you in a moment. We recognize that summer is coming upon us, that there's always heightened concern about violence generally in this city, and that we need to prepare for that, and we are committing ourselves to exercise, as we do every year, but notably this year in a more culturally competent way, culturally specific way, as was the dialogue upstairs, some of those outreach efforts and some of our programming enhancements. It was, as I said, a very sober, it was a very honest, it was a very reflective conversation, but also it was reflective of the extraordinary talent and commitment and the breadth of diversity that marks, again, my optimism about San Francisco as a model city to others. With that, let me ask that the police chief and then President of the Board of Supervisors, David Chu, come up and say a few words. We're blessed to have representatives as well from the Police Commission, one of our heroes in San Francisco and one of our real leaders and a voice for compassion and reason and thoughtfulness and more importantly, empowerment, Cecil Williams and Jan. Also, I'd like to hear from them, and again, we'll happily take any questions you have. Chief, if you could say some words.
First of all, we want to make it really clear that we want to validate the concerns within the Chinese community and the Asian community at large regarding this acts of violence. I think it's also important that we get out a very clear message that the police department and the entire city and county family are together in this to ensure that those that have committed a crime will be brought to justice. I recognize that there are three major events that have occurred here in the county and the city that have led many people to be concerned, but we also recognize that there are many other events, and as the mayor mentioned, some of them have been unreported. We want to ensure that the community understands the commitment that the police department has to public safety. The events that we're talking about, obviously we started with the event in January which led to the death of an elderly, Mr. Chen, in March. And that particular homicide is still unsolved, and there's a commitment from all of us in mayor support and the president of the board of supervisors to provide a reward in order to hopefully encourage people that may have information concerning this event so that this event can be put closer to it and those that are responsible for it are brought to justice. But I think it's also important to recognize that there were two other major events that occur here in the city and county where arrests have been made. We're talking about the incident where we had a 56-year-old lady that was in attempt robbery, and she was pushed onto the offside the platform of the Muni. And in that particular case, the suspects in that case were arrested, and they were arrested because members of the African American community provided the information that was critical in order to make that arrest. And in fact, members of the African American community that were at the scene were the ones that rendered first aid in that particular incident. So I think it's important to recognize that as much as race is a factor in this event, it's also important to recognize that there are good people of every group in our communities that are working together and trying to deal with this problem. More recently, we had another event in a Muni bus where we had a Muni driver that was assaulted, and he was assaulted by a group of Hispanic and African American youth. In that particular case, again, there were two African American women, one that came to the aid of this Muni driver, and another one, an African American woman, that reported this crime to the police. And in this case, again, suspects were taken into custody as a result of people that were there, that were willing to be witnesses and provided assistance. So I think while it is critical to understand and validate the concerns that are out there within the Chinese community and the fact that we have to continue to do a better job of providing for their safety as well as the safety of every other community, I think it's also important for us to communicate effectively to all of our communities that good people in every community are working together in order to resolve these crimes, and that we recognize it for what it is. There are people out there that are bent on hurting anyone. There are crimes of opportunity, and in many cases, Chinese Americans have been the victims, but there are also many other cases. We have had members of other communities that have been victimized over and over again. We need to work together on this. The police department is fully committed to the safety of the Chinese community, and we'll be definitely working with them in order to deal with these issues.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to first of all thank everyone who took part in this afternoon's meeting, as well as all of you, for the incredible importance of this issue. And I first want to start off by saying that I hope, with regard to the press, that you cover this issue with the sensitivity that is due. This is an issue that involves race, but there are many elements that go far beyond race. As our chief just enumerated, we are talking about a number of Chinese victims who were victimized by assailants who we now know in some instances had victimized individuals from our community of many different races. We also know that there were many good Samaritans. There were many witnesses on the scene from the African American community that have assisted some of the Chinese victims here, and I hope you cover that. In the last few days, it has been absolutely apparent that community leaders, both from the Asian community, the African American community, and frankly from every background here in San Francisco, has stepped up to say enough with the violence. I've had conversations with Mayor Ron Dellums. I've had conversations with Mrs. Yu, the widow of one of the victims, and everyone understands that we have to move beyond what has happened. I think the conversation that we had this afternoon laid out a number of good ideas that the mayor and the rest of us will be fleshing out in the days to come. I think in the short run, really educating the public about the importance of stepping forward and the announcement of a reward to ensure that justice is done is important. In the medium term, we are going to have a conversation about the importance of prioritizing violence prevention services, the importance of prioritizing culturally sensitive, language-specific investigations, services to victims, and monitoring and law enforcement. This is something we are all focused on. And I think in the long term, we know that the communities within which these issues have happened are communities that are truly suffering. And it's important for all of us to, I think, take a step back and think about what we can do as a community, as a broader society, to really invest the resources that we need there. I very much look forward to, I know, the meetings that we are going to be having in the community and with community leaders from across the spectrum in San Francisco to ensure that we take this crisis and turn it into an opportunity for change. And I want to thank our mayor and, again, all the leaders here for the work that we're doing to move in this direction.
You've never seen me have Jan behind me, right? First and foremost, what the mayor said is critical. We have work to do, and we are going to continue to work because we know that this city, this great city, operates from the position of diversity. And that's what we live and what we try to make sure happens. And we want a city that is diverse, always. And so therefore, what we've done today is, again, attributed to the fact that diversity people worked on a diverse issue. And so we've come together. And it's not over. We know that. But we know one thing, that when we work with people and when people work with us, talking about in our city, when we work together, there is nothing in the world that we cannot pull off, not really pull off. And that's where we're going. We're going to make sure that at least violence is talked about, related to, lived through, and that hopefully this city will not have violence occur because we are the city of St. Francis. Say something.
Well, I certainly affirm that violence should not be tolerated. I think the one way that we can address violence is to make sure that we are all human beings, that we perceive each other as human beings, and that we have to understand and reach out to all who feel that they are voiceless and make sure people have a voice, and that we can begin to understand each other truly as one common humanity.
Thank you. And President Marshall?
Nobody likes the violence. Nobody. And you can see by the fact that we were in there way past our appointed time, a couple hours of conversation, that we really wanted to delve into deeply into the issues that are involved here. It was a great meeting. You've heard from everybody who has spoken so far that we're pretty much all on the same page. We want the violence to stop. We're working on some short and long-term plans for that. Each of us have areas of expertise in this, and we'll all be sharing those areas of expertise with the mayor. There's a mentality out there that is hurting our citizens. And in this case, that mentality particularly hurt one ethnic group in this city. We've got to deal with that mentality, because in reality, that mentality hurts everyone in this city that it runs across. And so this was, again, it was an extraordinary meeting. I've been around, done this work for a long time. I really haven't seen anything like that. It was very focused, it was very targeted, and it's just the beginning. And the fact that all of us are up here and you're here and you waited so long tells all of you how serious this is. And I know with me, my real work is with the perpetrators, those that commit these crimes, those that put us in the position that we are here today. And we're committed, all of us are committed to doing something about that mentality that is hurting each and every one of us. You got my word, and I think you have the commitment of everybody up here that we will work hard so that this will not continue.
Thank you. Mr. Sesser?
Well, thank you, Mayor Newsom, President Board of Supervisors, for convening the meeting. As we all said, we love the diversity that we have here in San Francisco. But along with diversity, we have to acknowledge that there are differences. And part of the challenge of living together and being together is how we respect those differences and how we live together in those differences. But what we heard in the meeting is, as the mayor described, we're just scratching the surface. And what we heard in the meeting was that there was a lot of fear in these communities. And that fear seemed fairly universal, that the fear wasn't only in the Asian community, the fear wasn't only in the African American community, and that as many of us who've done this work, even prior to many of the roles we've had, whether we've been in the community, and you had people who've run acclaimed nationwide programs. And I think the struggle that we are having is we're coming together and we're talking about these very tough issues. But at the same time, we're also acknowledging that we have to open up ourselves to listen, to think differently, and that we may need to do things differently. And in particular, these attacks, we know, exacerbate a problem that has existed for a long time. And the reason the problem's existed for quite a while is because these are tough issues. But, as the mayor alluded to, and I share the confidence with all the people in the room, you had in the room a completely committed 40 to 50 people, many of whom who've done this work for 20, 30, 40 years tirelessly. And I think the commitment that we walked away wasn't the promise that we're going to fix this issue tomorrow, but that tomorrow we're going to get up and we're going to continue to work on these issues, and that we're going to work on them by standing up with our communities, bringing our communities together, and acknowledging that there's a lot of pain out there and that people simply want it to stop. And that we have to work together to make sure we give that space to our communities so they can come forward. That they can come forward and be heard and be acknowledged, and so that the police can do their job. The district attorney can do her job. That the mayor can do his job, and the board can do their job of first and foremost making sure that every citizen in this city is safe. And that is something that is absolutely something that we were 100% committed to.
Supervisors, would you like to say anything?
I'll just keep it brief, but I do want to say that I appreciate that we had a meeting today to get different members of the community together, but I do want to say that this is truly just the beginning of the conversation. It's by no means the ending of the problems that we have had. One of the things and one of the people I think who has been instrumental in where we have gotten to now, Vincent Pan with our police commission, who has done a great amount of work in terms of talking to the Asian American community, is someone that we really need to acknowledge at this point. But in addition to that, I think not only was today's meeting very important, but the meetings that we had seen before. I attended a community meeting on Saturday where there were many people who were just normal residents who were talking about their experiences living out in different parts of our neighborhood. And that's where we really need to go with this conversation. It's not the end of the conversation. We need to bring those meetings. We need to go out. We need to listen to the community and to hear about what people's experiences on a day-to-day level are. And so I just want to say that I appreciate the efforts that we've made today, but this is by no means the ending of it.
I was just going to thank the mayor and city administrator Ed Lee and others for bringing so many of us together. There were a lot of heartfelt comments, and I think, like Supervisor Chu mentioned, it's the start of a process. I also would like to acknowledge that as a Chinese American, I do feel like the acknowledgement that Chinese Americans are feeling victimized in the Bayview Hunters Point area or Viz Valley was a key issue that was addressed, and I feel that I was listened to as a Chinese American. I do feel that the mayor and many of the nonprofit organizations and community-based groups that were in the room are committing to not just reaching the leadership to speak out in a strong voice about unity and building unity out of this the tragedies, but also how grassroots youth-serving agencies and violence reduction organizations need to be much more supported, and victim services need to be much more culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate for reaching out to not just Asian Americans, but also to African Americans in the districts that we represent. So thanks so much to Mayor Newsom for convening us together.
And Commissioner, Mr. Pan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In addition to serving on the Police Commission, and actually this is my last week on the Police Commission, I'm the Executive Director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. And it's really in that capacity in which I've been hearing for quite some time a number of very serious and disturbing reports of violence in certain parts of our city. I think diversity is a wonderful thing, and all of us have to champion it, and all of us have to work on it at every turn. But at the same time, diversity does present challenges, and we do ourselves a disservice if we don't talk honestly about those challenges. I want to thank Commissioner Marshall for inviting me on his radio show last night, because we began to have one of those honest conversations. And I think that the meeting today was another one of those honest conversations. And those of us who are seen as leaders in the city have a responsibility to have those tough talks, even when there are disagreements. And I think that there are disagreements. But nevertheless, there is unity around working through the hard issues to figure out where there's common ground. The reality, though, is at the ground level and in the communities that we're talking about, I don't believe that enough of their concerns have been heard. And you have people who are literally crying out for help. And I think that what I'm most hopeful that comes out of this is that as a city family, with all of our great diversity, that we get out to these communities that have been crying out for a long, long time, from the African American community, and maybe only more recently from the Chinese American community. But this is an issue that affects all of us, but it affects all of us differently, and I think it's important to acknowledge that those differences are legitimate and they're valid.
Thank you. And Ed, talk a little bit more. Let me just acknowledge Ed Lee, our city administrator, who for the last number of weeks was out front and helping organize some of our efforts to bring folks together. And Ed, as you begin, if you could close, and then we'll answer any questions.
First of all, this is a great city. It's a great city to work for. It's a great city to live in. And nobody should fear being able to get on Muni and being able to get to where they need to go and feel safe coming home after what they need to do. yet some people are. And so not only the people standing around me are working on that with our mayor's leadership and the board's leadership, but we will commit ourselves to make sure every community that has individuals who have that fear, that we can address it quickly, and make sure we live not only with the diversity we have, but we also live as one city as well. That the very basic things we come to attach ourselves, whether it's riding muni, shopping, eating, having some fun with friends, that everybody can do it with the element that they appreciate it and respect each other. And we're going to get the word out to those individuals who don't listen, who are not part of our mainstream, who are committing these acts. We're going to join and unite ever more closely with all of our community leaders to make sure we send that message out, that violence is not to be tolerated, that there is respect for our seniors, respect for our neighbors, and that we've got to live with that common level of humanity. So this is what it's been about, and I'm very, very glad that all these people came together, and I look forward to the great hard work, but the good work that we're going to be doing together. Thank you.
So in that spirit, on this topic,
what's the reward that's going to be offered?
Chief, we'll figure that out in the next day or so, and make the formal announcement in terms of the size of the reward. Yeah.
And talk about short-term solutions.
Well, we're going to immediately, we've had a work group that's been convened of sorts, and I don't know if work group's the right phrase, but we've identified, and I think it was suggestive, that the folks that were in this room, the caliber of folks in this room, the key leaders in our community that will be engaged in a proactive effort of outreach to reach out to communities that don't come down to City Hall, that don't show up at town hall meetings, that are nervous to show up at community meetings, even small meetings. And I think one of the things that I heard that really, that I'm underscoring, that really reinforced and allowed me to recognize that we have a lot more work to do, was the fact that there are a lot of folks that are truly fearful, that are scared to death, that are not communicating in any way, shape, or form their experiences in our city. And they need to be touched, and they need to be engaged. And so the most important thing from my perspective is to reach out to them. And we'll be working with a number of people you see behind me and some of the folks that were in that room to organize a specific outreach effort to connect with those that feel disconnected to the city and that are not necessarily the people that, again, are showing up at these community meetings. So that's most important. Second, I think we need a public education campaign in the city. I think people need to see that this city is working together, that its leadership understands this issue, that we understand the fear, and that we recognize we've got work to do. And so I am committed to a public education campaign, and that will take many shapes, be it communicating with social media network sites like Facebook and YouTube, and utilizing tools of technology, but also engaging in more traditional means of outreach and education in a very culturally competent way, so people can see, not just hear, that this city is working together, and we can begin to address some of the fears as they're manifested on our streets. You're going to see, obviously, more, just back to bread and butter issues, more police presence, as you've seen, in terms of footbeats, people on muni buses, and we are going to be hyper-vigilant in that respect and continue those efforts. We also want to, as was said, reach out to victims and reach out to our community-based organizations to make sure that they're on the same page, and any new funding. And I think this is an opportunity in the last few weeks, as I'm putting my budget together, to make sure that our budgets, our resources are aligned to this collective effort as well. So it's not just rhetoric, there's real dollars behind these efforts.
Mayor, this last incident happened about a month ago. Why didn't we do anything then?
Well, we've been doing a lot. We've been talking a lot about these things, and we have been. I think what's interesting, I started the meeting by having a conversation, or rather exposing a conversation I had with Supervisor Chu, who grabbed me last week and said that we need to get more public on this, because there are a lot of things the city family was doing that no one necessarily knew about, and that we needed to expose some of the work that has been done already. And you heard a little bit about the meetings that have already been engaged or underway, the community meetings Supervisor Chu was at, and police chief's been a number of them. We had we had commissioners like Vincent Pan and Joe Marshall that are out there using radio. There's been a lot of efforts. Ed Lee formed a group with Dwayne Jones and with other members of the community that have been organizing outreach efforts as well over the last few months, and the police chief. And I've had a lot of conversation, particularly with Chinese press, about the specific police efforts we have engaged in to make sure that there's ample resources to reduce the violence, particularly in the southeast sector, not just on 3rd Street, but as was noted in Visitacion Valley.
Can you speak a little bit about, beyond the race of suspects in these incidents, your youth as well, too? What role does the age of the person?
Well, that's, to me, there's an issue of, I commented about this, and it's a big issue. We have a Family Violence Prevention Council we put together a number of years ago that connected domestic violence, child abuse, and elder abuse together. And the issue of elder abuse is a major issue in this city, this state, and in this country. And the one thing that tends to be a common denominator here is you've got people that are more prone to be victims by the basis of their age. And that's a concern not just here in San Francisco, but the obvious and tragic incident in the East Bay. And so reaching out into our senior community, our elder community is critical in this case as well. And then you have youth that continue. Look, the toughest part about this, and I think it's the toughest part for the African American community, is you want victims of violence. African American community is disproportionately victims of violence. And we've had a lot of challenges with black on black crime for years and years in this city. And that's another underlying issue here that also still needs to be addressed. We don't want, some folks have cautioned that, it'd be nice if we had this kind of response every time there was a violent crime against African Americans. But we've come in this city in so many respects to sort of accept a certain amount of that. I've never felt that we do, but some people believe that we do because we've allowed so many crimes to continue in our city for so many years. So we've got just, and I think, I don't know if it was who just made that point, but we've got a lot of work to do across the board here. This is by no means, I think Cecil said it, exclusive to one community or another. It's just been heightened as it relates to the victimization of the Chinese community lately. But it just underscores for all the good work we've done in reducing violence in this city. And remember, violent crime is down significantly in this city. Our homicide rate's half of what it was 2 years ago. And we're continuing, our trends are continuing in the right direction. The police chief just announced his latest Part 1 crime reductions. It's still not good enough, and I guess that's my point. There's still an enormous amount of violence that exists, even though the larger trends are beginning to mitigate, and we've got to address those issues, and the issues of youth, the issues of seniors, the use of vulnerable communities continue, and so this was a clarion call more broadly, but very specifically the reason we came around the table was these latest incidences against the Chinese community.
Mayor, it seems like what I'm hearing tonight is that violence is everywhere. But it sounds like you're hesitant to say that this is any kind of racial profiling going on.
Well, I don't want to.
Or a hate crime. Yeah. Is there a hate crime here?
Well, I'll leave that to the investigations that are underway. I mean, there are, and the chief, and perhaps Chief, you can talk about this. There have been arrests, and the chief can talk about publicly what is appropriate to talk about and what precipitated the arrests and what the early investigations have found. But we want to be cautious here and not be hyperbolic and jump to conclusions. And I think the chief is uniquely positioned to walk through these 3 specific incidences, again, that have been highlighted in the city. By no means are they exclusive, and talk about where we are in terms of the investigation of those 3 and in terms of the apprehension of the suspects.
First of all, concerning the homicide, we don't know because the suspect is not in custody. We haven't been able to interview the person involved. We haven't been able to get sufficient evidence to get a really understanding of what occurred there. But when we're talking about the other 2 crimes, the one with the 56-year-old lady that was pushed off the platform, and then the more recent event in Muni, the suspects in these cases have been arrested. They are being prosecuted. And the assistance that allowed us to make those arrests came from people that were at the scene, and it was cross-racial assistance. In those two cases, we don't have any evidence to support the legal definition of a hate crime. And I know that this is a very sensitive area because I know that within the Chinese community, many believe that race has played a factor, and that therefore, because race has played a factor, this should be viewed within the legal definition of a hate crime. But as we can tell at this point, we don't see race as a motivation. There were no additional factors other than the fact that the suspect, in one case, they were African American, in the other case, they were African American and Hispanic. We have not been able to support the proposition that this was a hate crime as it is defined by the law. Not to say, and again, I want to be very careful here because I know this is very sensitive, there was clearly a race factor there. The victims were Chinese American, the suspects, in one case, African American, in the other case, African American and Hispanic. And I also want to underline that we recognize that there are many other cases, and many other cases that are not reported. What we want to communicate to the Chinese American community, as well as the rest of our communities, is there is a tremendous commitment to do the right thing here, to reduce violence. We have, since mid-March, we have put additional resources in the platforms in the areas where we, based on reported crime, know that we're more likely to have robberies and assaults. We are putting a great deal of attention to these areas. I think it's really very important for you and the media, and especially, quite frankly, for the Chinese-speaking media, to communicate the message that is being put out here today, because I think that there is so much misconception that there is no question that we, and I include myself in this, have to do a better job of reaching out and communicating directly with the communities that are being impacted by this. But I think it would be critical for you to communicate also that the motivation that we're seeing in these crimes hasn't been race, as we can tell by the evidence. It's been robbery, it's been opportunity, but certainly we have not seen at this point race being a factor. Now, again, I underline, we have a homicide, the suspect is not in custody, and we do not know what the motivation in that case was.
They have a sickness called monkey see, monkey do, monkey hear. And in the Asian community, they say, we don't see, we don't hear, we don't do. They don't get involved, they don't talk. What are you going to do that the American flag is right behind you to make them feel like they're an equal part of this city?
Well, everybody, I mean, look, everyone should know that that they should participate in the life of their community by knowing that they will be respected and protected in the context of communicating any crimes or incidents or any violence in their community. It's absolutely essential. Law enforcement does not work, or in terms of reducing the likelihood of crime and violence, it's not enhanced if people do not communicate and do not engage in terms of the investigation of these crimes. And everybody in the city should know that this department, the city, values that participation, encourages that participation, and at times rewards that participation. And it's incumbent that every community feel confident to be fully engaged in the life of their city, and that includes making sure that they are part of the investigations against those that have become victims.
On another note, are you able to talk at all about the 49ers?
Why don't we? I never thought I'd look forward to the 49er discussion. But are there any other questions on this, so I can let them go and then I can talk?
Just wondering that because in the previous cases, it all happened along the 3rd Street, the Bayview, Hunters Point district. So do you think the district, I mean, in that district, a lot of Asian and African American living there, do you think this kind of maybe through the living racial tension increase and then kind of escalate some kind of this violence?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the stats bear out, and you know, Chief, let's talk a little bit more about the data. It's anecdotal. There's obviously heightened concern because of these 3 high-profile incidents. By no means, and it's been suggested over and over again, are these exclusive incidents, and we recognize that. A lot of the incidences are not reported to the point of the previous question. But the trends don't necessarily bear that out. But we are concerned because of these high-profile recent incidents that perhaps there is something going on that needs a heightened level of response and deserves the type of scrutiny that we are paying. But Chief, perhaps you can talk a little bit more specifically about that. Yeah.
From my standpoint, as someone who works with young people and knows this mentality pretty well, they don't know anything about gentrification. They don't know anything about any of that. Crimes of opportunity, robbery, there's a mentality that drives them to commit these particular crimes. I doubt that they are that sophisticated in terms of that. They see something, they take it, an iPod or whatever they want to get. So there may be those factors there, but I don't think in these particular cases that was there.
Well, you know, there's a couple of things. I mean, the incidence of shootings, for instance, and the incidence of victims of shootings this year is down when compared to last year. Although homicides are slightly up from last year, we still are way below what the norm was just 2 years ago, 3 and 4 years ago. So we know that violence in general is down. We also know that, quite frankly, although violence in general is down, black on black crime still continues to dominate the dialogue when we're talking about violence. So the majority of the violent crime, including homicides, when you look proportionally to the number of African Americans in the city and you look at the number of homicide victims, it continues to be black on black. And that doesn't make it any better, but I think it's important, again, to communicate the fact that we just don't see that wholesale racial assault from one group into the other. Again, and I'm being very careful about how I say this because I do not want to invalidate the feelings that are within the Chinese American community. We heard from Supervisor Hsu, we've heard from our police commissioner, Vin Pan, about the concerns that are out there. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we get factual information as to what the numbers are, but we also want to validate the concerns and we want to deal with those concerns. And at the end of the day, we want to ensure that all communities that we serve should be able to feel safe, and we got to do everything that we can to make that happen.
There's no doubt the perception, though, that there is that sentiment and that fear. And that we accept, we acknowledge, and every single one of us today in that room understands that. And perception sometimes can become reality in terms of people's focus and mine, and that reality is self-evident in the context of those that were victimized. So we do take that very, very seriously. Any other questions on this, guys?
Just follow-up question is that also recently in Oakland there is a high-profile case happened also, and then also that, and then that man is from San Francisco. So do you think these two cities is going to work together, figure out something?
No doubt. I mean, and one of the things that I admire most about our police chief is the collaboration and coordination he's had with his colleagues in various law enforcement agencies. The answer is yes, though not just from law enforcement perspective, but a lot of community leaders you see behind me and a lot of the folks that were in that room have long-standing relationships with their counterparts in Oakland and the East Bay. Look, we're all in this together, and that is something that is not lost on any of us. So the answer is yes, there's a lot of collaboration. Thank you, guys. I'm happy to answer these other things doing here. Good, man.
Go ahead. Oh, yeah. See you, man. Yeah. Come down and see you. All right. Okay.